Words Aptly Spoken, which comes from Proverbs 25:11. A word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in settings of silver. The written word is a precious treasure. We want to preserve written knowledge for God's glory and as an anchor to the history of the church and its classical conversations. We hope to encourage the reading of words and of the word.
Well, welcome to Words Aptly Spoken, where Lee Borton's Jennifer Courtney and I discuss books from the Classical Conversations curated curriculum. This is the series for lovers of the word made flesh. It is Wednesday, October 23rd, 2024, and I am Timothy Knotts. As you can tell, Lee is usually the one doing all this introduction, but she is away today. So today, Jennifer and I are joined by Brittany Lewis, who is one of our Classical Conversations multimedia curriculum developers, and Daniel Shirley, who is both a CC graduate and our CC Plus program manager. So welcome, Brittany and Daniel.
Thank you.
Glad to be here.
Jennifer, you want to share about this month's shows?
Yeah, so this month we are exploring the Classical Conversations Cultivating Christian Leaders resources. I actually am in Phoenix, where I just discussed these very resources yesterday with the CC book reps. So my life is very harmonious at the moment. And we had some great conversations about the idea of cultivating Christian leaders as a title. So maybe we'll get to do that sometime here. But already this month, we have discussed one of my favorites, Honey for a Child's Heart by Gladys Hunt, and The Hurried Child by Dr. Elkind. And then today we're going to talk about Nancy Pearcey's Total Truth, and we will finish up this month's recordings with the book When People Are Big and God is Small.
You can access all of those past episodes on Lee's YouTube channel, which is at Lee Bortons, or on Lee's website, leebortons.com. Otherwise, Jennifer, we can go ahead and get started.
Okay, well, Tim, I'm going to pick on you. You know, I usually ask Lee why we have books either in our curriculum or as recommended resources in our catalog, but she's not here to ask. So I'm going to ask you, why does Classical Conversations recommend this book, Total Truth, to leaders in our communities and in their homes?
Yeah. So obviously I haven't been around long enough to have selected this book or even be part of the selecting of this book, but I can tell you why I would recommend this book to our leaders and parents. It's written as a really nice introduction to a Christian worldview, not in a highfalutin way, but also not in a way that dumbs it down. Nancy Pearcey does a really good job of emphasizing the importance of first things and trying to bring some degree of clarity and even some simplicity to something that's a very big and complicated issue. And you know, we live in an era that some people have described as being post-truth, and this book is written, I think, before that came into its own in the way that we see it around us right now, but is still very useful in bringing those most important things to the front so that we can see them sort of in the light of day and take away some of the confusion of all the vagaries of real life around us that make them harder to see.
Yeah, that's so good. And as you mentioned, this has become, even since she wrote the book, we've had even more of a need to have that idea of total truth. I know last year my Challenge 4 students were wrestling with, what does it mean when people say my truth and versus the truth? And so this book is really helpful for us navigating those conversations with our families. And it's another fun connection to this book is that I know Nancy Pearcey was heavily influenced by Francis Schaeffer, who we also study in our challenge programs. And so it's fun. Sometimes I can hear his voice peeking through her writing, which is nice connection. So, all right. Well, Brittany, we use lots of resources by Dr. Pearcey. This is not the only one. And so we talked before about how she is such a deep thinker. And she's also a friend of CC and our mission. So tell us a little bit about our author for today.
Well, she is, well, as we know, our mission is to know God and to make him known. And I think she's a great example for us because she is known as this preeminent thinker. The Economist called her America's preeminent evangelical Protestant female intellectual.
Wow.
But when she tells her story, I know it's a big compliment. When she tells her story in the book, she reminds me of our students. She reminds me of me when I was a kid too, because she was asking big questions to people in her church and her family. And her questions were about the nature of reality. How could Christianity possibly be true? And they were she felt like they were patting her on the head and saying, there, everybody doubts. And she thought, well, we can do better. We must do better than this. We must equip our children with the intellectual tools to answer the questions, because if Christianity is the worldview that reflects all of truth, reflects reality the most clearly, the most fully, then it ought to be able to stand up to those questions. Currently, she's a professor and scholar in residence at Houston Christian University, and her focus in teaching is Christian worldview and apologetics. And like you said, she was a student when she was an agnostic of Francis Schaeffer at L'Abri. She went there twice. Once she left in dismay because she was so worried that she was going to make an emotional choice. She really wanted to test Christianity against all the other worldviews, against all the other religions, and see which could hold up to her questions. And then she did some graduate level work at the Institute for Christian Studies in Toronto. She received her MA in Biblical Studies through Covenant Theological Seminary. And then I think her undergrad work was at Iowa State University. So she's a wonderful thinker and a great model for my girls. Her books have been some of our favorites in our family to talk about, and for my son too. Being able to discern what is true and how Christianity answers those questions and gives us a lens to view the world. That's exactly what we're trying to do at Classical Conversations.
Yeah, it sounds like from your bio of her that she probably earned what the Economist said about her. And so she really is very well educated and has wrestled these things down herself. And I appreciate her testimony of wanting intellectual answers to her questions, because that was really why my husband and I wanted to home educate our kids. And I've probably shared this before, but we both got what the world would consider to be a good education. We had lots of advanced classes and access to lots of resources and all those things, but it, like many people our age at least, that was totally divorced from what we did on Sunday. And no one was there to help us put those two things together. And so they just stayed on these separate tracks, and we didn't want our kids to have that same experience. So I appreciate her work for that reason.
Me too.
Yeah. All right. So Daniel, on this book club, we love to talk about titles because, there's a reason that books are titled the way they are. And Total Truth sounds like this authoritarian title, but then it's also got this nice academic subtitle, Liberating Christianity from Its Cultural Captivity. So tell us about this title. Is the book as difficult as the title?
Okay, so this is great. I can share with you all my system for assessing books.
Okay.
So when I see, the title is obviously the first piece. It's like that glance across the cafeteria, right? You see somebody, you're like, maybe I'll go talk to them. And so when I assess these books, it's kind of like having small talk, right? You've seen it, you've approached it. Now you're going to pick the book up and you're going to assess two things. By the way, these are not good things to assess for like actual relationships if you're trying to make friends with people. Size and density.
Okay.
Size and density. Right. So
Good.
size. Go ahead.
I said good for books, not people. Got it.
Correct. The analogy has a limit. All right. So size and density. Size is just essentially how many words and pages the book has. Maybe how it's laid out in some sense. That could also play into density. But density is usually more along the assessment of topics and content of the text. So I went through and gathered some helpful metrics to hopefully give our readers some dimension to what their engagement with this book might look like. So let's see. Also, it's good to note, you shouldn't ever feel guilty about assessing a book for its size. As a student, I always felt guilty if I was going to like measure out how many pages I had to read or something like that. That's totally fine. We should do that, especially as we get busier. So this book has a roughly 378 pages at around 400 words a page. So doing some quick mathematical operations, we can kind of assess and arrive that this will roughly be an 11-hour read for whoever is wanting to attend it. So, you know, it could be a week, could be a month. 11 hours is a good estimate for the total journey. So on density, of the density front, the topical front, I think that, like Tim already kind of said, Piercy does a good job of keeping everything fairly simple. She uses some fun charts, especially in that kind of two-story house section where she's going to map things for us visually as she explains them to us with words. And she'll illustrate her points from several angles. I know that we'll read some sections here together in a little bit, so we'll get a sense of the conversational tone. But I find it more conversational rather than technical. And then the topic that she addresses primarily is the topic of worldview. I have a lot of thoughts on worldview as a topic in general, but I'll couch those. Piercy sets this concept up, talking about it in kind of three primary ways. The first one is that worldview is kind of a mental map. So it's, think about it like a map to navigate immaterial spaces. And then the fundamental nature of worldview is not merely academic, but is oriented toward deepening spiritual character. And all worldview has three parts, which I think we might talk about a little bit later, but the creation aspect, the why did things go wrong, the fall, and then the kind of redemption arc. How do we get back? So yeah, I'd say all in all, the size, average intimidation level, the topical could be on the higher end of the intimidation factor, but the way that she kind of couches it in more conversational language, complete with visual aid, I think reduces that to more approachable. So.
Yeah, I really appreciate what you said, Daniel, and I want to highlight several pieces of it. So one is that I also like to investigate what my investment in a book is. And I think that's important for us because we are busy to find, it may be that, you know, a book is not coming to us at the right time because we literally do not have the time to give to this book. So but also as people who develop curriculum, we're always thinking about how much time are we asking from our students this week. So we should all evaluate and think about our relationships with books in that way and the time we have to give it. So I loved that. And then the second thing is I appreciated what you said about you know, flipping through and inspecting the book. So Mortimer Adler would call that some inspectional reading that you did to flip through and see, okay, she has this table of contents that maybe sounds intimidating, but it's clear from her drawings and other helps throughout the book that she's going to unpack things in a way and you have some support. So I appreciate that inspectional look at the book too, because that's good for us to do before we read. So then would you say that the way that worldview is connected to the total truth title is that she means that your mental map should be cohesive. So it's this spiritual and academic, like help me can make that connection.
Right. Yeah, I think that the spiritual and the academic or the intellectual, and we could just go through and list all the different aspects of the human experience, right? all of the different dimensions or domains ought to be unified inside the space of the Christian worldview, which is total truth. It's not like only political truth. That's also just a worse title, but there's a reason that's not the title of the book. And so, yeah, the Christian worldview is meant to kind of recapture and draw together all of these different domains in the modern world where it's kind of been, I don't know, kicked out of.
Yeah, fragmented. Good.
Mm.
All right. Well, in the introduction, there is an epigraph, which is a little quotation that helps to cast the vision for the whole book. This is another good thing to do when you're doing Daniel's inspectional reading of a text, is to look at the epigraph. It'll tell you a lot. But so this quote in this book is from Francis Schaeffer, and it says this, quote, "Christianity is not a series of truths in the plural, but rather truth spelled with a capital T, truth about total reality, not just about religious things. Biblical Christianity is truth concerning total reality and the intellectual holding of that truth and then living in light of that truth." So what do you guys think about this quote? How does that change our thoughts about the world and our mission as home educators here in CC? Do you want to kick us off, Tim?
Yeah, capitalizing a word is an interesting thing, right? Our editors are usually pretty opposed to miscellaneous capitals in our writing. But we do grant that status to things of a special importance, things that are transcendent in a way, like we capitalize God's pronouns when we talk about him. And I think that's sort of in a sense, the point that Schaeffer is making is that this truth is a transcendent truth, right? It's not a truth that's within the worldview. It's a truth that's above and encompasses the worldview that Nancy Pearcey is talking about. And that's a very realist point of view, right? That we live in a reality that God has created, and that we, as C.S. Lewis would put it, right, we're conforming our souls to reality as we become educated.
Yeah, and kind of like piggybacking off of that idea of conforming our souls toward reality, this reminds me of a G.K. Chesterton quote, which, if you guys don't mind, I'll read real quick.
Yeah, be great.
He's talking about worldview, but from like a slightly, he calls it a view of the universe or a theory of the cosmos. But he says, but there are some people, nevertheless, and I am one of them, who think that the most practical and important thing about a man is still his view of the universe. We think that for a landlady considering a lodger, it is important to know his income, but it is more important to know his philosophy. We think that for a general about to fight his enemy, it's important to know the enemy's numbers, but it's still more important to know the enemy's philosophy. We think the question is not whether the theory of the cosmos affects matters, but whether in the long run, anything else affects them. Mm-hmm. And so this is kind of off this epigraph. It's not a series of truths in the plural, like these lower, like how much does the lodger make, or how many troops are in the enemy's army. It's kind of this ultimate capital T truth, which is what is this reality that we occupy and inhabit, and how do we conform ourselves to it?
It's good.
So good.
How about you, Brittany?
I was thinking about a different quote. I love that quote that Daniel shared. This quote reminded me of Colossians 1, where that beautiful 15 through 20 talks about how Christ is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. It's like a song, right? I think people have turned those words into a song. But thinking about how he is the one that holds things together. Truth is a person. Christ himself. And that reminded me of a C.S. Lewis quote from Weight of Glory from his essay, Is Theology Poetry? I'm sure it's a quote that's familiar to us. I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun is risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. And this quote and the focus of the book is to help us think about the ideas we encounter and the ideas that our children encounter, and think about whether they're actually true ideas, and to help our students wrestle with and come to understand that Christ is the one who holds all things together. And I just really appreciate Nancy Piercy's desire. She was a homeschooling mom too. And she said that our children ought to encounter the isms of the world through us first. And so I appreciate this quote because it inspires me to keep doing that, this is important, that we talk about the transcendent, the permanent things, truth being the truth of Christ at the center of all things that holds things together.
Yeah, I really appreciate that you brought that back. I think it is okay in this case for us and altogether fitting for us to capitalize truth. And this is a conversation I had with my Challenge 4 students last year, and our students are getting bombarded with very confusing messages right now. Our culture is very confused, and I kept encouraging them in pursuing truth. And finally, one day I stopped and said, "You guys are misusing the word truth. You think you're searching for some abstract thing out there. What you are searching for is the person of Jesus Christ, who is himself truth." And I think that remembrance will help you on your journey. So I appreciate you bringing that out, Brittany. All right, Tim, I think it's time for our break.
It is. We like to thank our sponsor, classicalconversationbooks.com, where all these books that we talk about can be purchased. You can find the 2024 Words Aptly Spoken calendar at leebortons.com. We're coming up on the end of that list. It won't be too much longer before you'll also find the 2025 Words Aptly Spoken calendar. And you'll find also the links to the CC book site there. So if you are interested in some of the books we've talked about and don't yet have them, go pick them up. You can look ahead to what we'll be talking about. Next week, we'll be looking at When People Are Big and God is Small by Edward Welch, which it will be a really good follow-up conversation, I think, after the talk that we're having today about total truth. All right, Jennifer, so we can head on into the book, I think.
Yeah. So one of the ways that we continue to inspect a book, besides all the tips that Daniel gave us, is to read the introduction, and particularly in nonfiction. I will tell you, I do not do this in fiction because there are spoilers, but I always read the introduction of nonfiction first, because the author's going to tell you a lot about why they wrote it and what kinds of questions they were trying to answer. So Daniel, why don't you share that passage with us?
You got it. I have to sneak it in though. If a book can be spoiled, is it worth reading?
I don't know. We're gonna have to take that another day.
Brittany says yes. Okay. Okay. So let's see. So this is from the introduction. To tell people that you were writing a book on worldview was to risk glazed stares and a quick change in subject. But today, as I travel around the country, I sense an eagerness among evangelicals to move beyond a purely privatized faith, applying biblical principles to areas like work, business, and politics. Flip open any number of Christian publications and you're likely to find half a dozen advertisements for worldview conferences, worldview institutes, and worldview programs. Clearly, the term itself has a strong marketing cachet these days, fancy, which signals a deep hunger among Christians for an overarching framework to bring unity to their lives. This book addresses that hunger and offers a new direction for advancing the worldview movement. It will help you identify the secular sacred divide that keeps your faith locked into the private sphere of religious truth, air quotes. It will walk you through practical, workable steps for crafting a Christian worldview in your own life and work. and it will teach you how to apply a worldview grid to cut through the bewildering maze of ideas and ideologies we encounter in a postmodern world. The purpose of worldview studies is nothing less than to liberate Christianity from its cultural captivity, unleashing its power to transform the world.
So what do you guys think about, we've talked a lot about unity, but when you were reading, Daniel, what caught my attention was that cultural captivity. What does she mean by that?
I think she's echoing something we talked about when we looked at Doug Wilson's book a few weeks back. He wrote in one of his essays in The Lost Tools of Learning that students are told, and many people try to believe, that they can go into their workspace or their academic life and sort of shelve everything that they believe in the way of Christian truths. So you can have an atheistic scientific life as a scientist, that then you sort of pick your faith back up on the way out of the lab to go into the rest of your life. And he points out that that's not, it's number one, not possible, not truly possible, and number two, isn't even real. Like, you can't really do that because necessarily things, right, what we know and believe will creep in. But I think there's some damage that we do to ourselves when we try to divide the things, and I think that's what Nancy Pearcey is getting at here is we hobble ourselves when we try to say, well, I believe this about this, and I believe that about that, but I don't have to reconcile them. I can just live in two worlds.
Just so confusing for our students. I heard I was listening to an interview with Nancy Pearcey. I love how clear-headed she is when she answers questions. She was talking about this upper story, lower story thing. And she said, no one says if you're sharing some sort of scientific fact, oh, that's just your science, don't impose that on me. But if I was to share something I believed about, something that was morally true, morally good, that I might get the response, that's just your religion, don't impose that on me. And we kind of, that's the world we live in, where we just kind of accept that. That's the world our students are living in. Even more so, I feel like now, because religion can even be viewed as something that just inspires you to, rather than something that you have a duty to, a creed that you should believe and walk, live out in your life.
Yeah, that's good. We hear that phrase all the time, right? I'm a person of faith. Well, faith in what? Right? Because your faith in what, or who in this case, determines every other idea that you have.
Yeah. This captivity, I feel like, largely stems from you could say like a spirit of timidity and a spirit of fear, right? With this, because we've all had uncomfortable situations where we brought up something meaningful, important, valuable, like a moral stance or a judgment that we've made that will ignite like a Thanksgiving dinner into conflict, right, amongst your extended family or something. So it's like there's a double edge to this, where it's like very much it's appropriate for the Christian message and view of the cosmos to inhabit all domains of reality, but there's also an edge to it where it's going to, and likely will, cause issues, hangups, rubs, conflicts. But to shy away from it is to kind of, participate in what Nietzsche calls the Slaven morale, right? The slave morality. And so I think it's something that's really interesting to wrestle with. What does it look like? How do we move out of that space of captivity?
That's good. All right. Well, Brittany, so we talked about this being about Pearcey talking about worldview a lot in this book. So Our next passage talks about one of the hidden but ultimate issues that we as Christians have to grapple with as we form this united worldview. So do you want to read that passage for us?
Sure. Thus, the key to restoring a unified concept of truth is to recover a robust concept of creation. Christianity has always taught that there is a single reality because it was created by a single, omnipotent, and all-wise God, explains one historical account. Given this creation story, it followed that knowledge too comprised a single whole. It was the doctrine of creation that undergirded confidence in the unity of truth. To be loyal to the great claims of our faith, we can no longer acquiesce in letting Christianity be shunted aside to the value sphere. We must throw off metaphysical timidity, be convinced that we have a winning case, and take the offensive. Armed with prayer and spiritual power, we need to ask God to show us where the battle is being fought today and enlist under the lordship and leadership of Christ.
That section reminds me a lot of our catechesis wheel in CC, right? That we have the different spheres. We have different spheres of life in our sort of everyday life, but in CC we have those spheres that roll around that are the strands that all circle around, touch on one another, and at the center of them is God. We don't have a Bible class or chapel time where spiritual truths are sort of shunted to that one part of the day, and now we'll go study physics, or now we'll go study, American government documents or something. But to look for the unified whole in it, that that knowledge of physics isn't walled off from knowledge of history or knowledge of the nature of man, right? That those are all things that are integrated into one another because they're part of a cosmos. So I love this section because it speaks to that graphic that reflects a truth, right? That we have a wholeness in that and not disintegration.
Yeah, my mind immediately went to the catechesis wheel too, Tim, because Lisa Bailey and I were podcasting about it 2 weeks ago. So it is on my mind. But one of the things that we talked about there is that because we have God in the center and all of the domains of knowledge being ordained by him, held together by him, and thus connected to one another, it is also true that our united studies should lead to worship. And so if we're looking at subatomic particles, we can acknowledge what Piercy says here, that there's a single reality, that those subatomic particles were created by this single omnipotent and all-wise God. And that should make us worship, because that's kind of an amazing thing that we can think about them when we can't actually see them.
If you're not familiar with the catechesis wheel, you can find it on the online CC catalog on page 8 if you're looking for something to see what we're talking about.
Yeah, and this, go ahead, Jennifer.
No, I was just going to call on you, Daniel, so you're good.
Hey, cool. Yeah, so that first line, thus the key to restoring a unified concept of truth is to recover a robust concept of creation. And that element, I just think of, what are we after inside the space of the classroom in challenge, for me, particularly challenge 4, and wrestling with these, Old Testament passages. We always spend a little bit of extra time on the contemplation of the first 3 chapters of Genesis inside, and just trying to delve in and unpack some of those questions, because the students have read that story 1,001 times, and they almost like can't see it anymore. So we have to stop down and almost look at each word and be like, what's going on here? And so I guess as a teacher, I've wondered, as a teacher, tutor, student, I've wondered about what this recovery of a robust robust concept of creation looks like, how we go about reinvigorating ourselves toward the world, because it's like the heart has to follow with the mind, if we're moving back toward this discovery of total truth, or this encounter with total truth.
Yeah, that's really good. That's one of my favorite things about Challenge 4 is looking at scripture together and seeing new things that we missed before, just because the thing was so familiar that we were no longer paying attention.
I heard a storyteller say this recently, that the most important parts of a story for you to revisit are not the ones that you remember and that cling to you and that you love, but are the pieces of the story that for some reason or another you can't hear. That, like, when you hear the story, the bit that you forget is the most important thing for you to go back and revisit. I don't know. I wonder if there's anything to that in this recovery effort.
Interesting. We used to, so in our home, one of the ways that played out was that when I did reading with everyone together, there's a 10-year gap between my oldest and my youngest. And so all the things that we weren't paying attention to, the littlest one was. And so she would always throw some kind of wrench into our reading, whether it was a literature story or something from the Bible. She would notice something that turned our whole conversation on its head, which was really, really fun to have that little one in there doing that for us.
It's like the Herdmans in
Yeah.
right, when they come to in the greatest Christmas pageant ever, and they show up and they're like, wait, what? About the Christmas story, when all the other kids are like, yeah, same story every year.
Yeah. That's a really good example of that. So, such a good book. All right. Well, we are closing in on time, so I'm going to move us on to our next passage. And so we talked a bit about, why, all of these resources, these cultivating Christian leaders, we have chosen for busy parents. And so one of the things about this book that makes it worth reading, even when you are a busy parent raising your children, is that it's not just ideological. It's not just ideas, but Piercy also gives us reasons why this idea of total truth is actually very practical. So Tim, do you want to read this one for us?
Yeah. In the days of the early church, the thing that most impressed their neighbors in the Roman Empire was the community of love they witnessed among believers. Behold how they love one another, it was said. In every age, the most persuasive evidence for the gospel is not words or arguments, but a living demonstration of God's character through Christians' love for one another, expressed in both their words and their actions. The gospel is not meant to be a disembodied message, Newbigin writes. It is meant to be fleshed out in a congregation of men and women who believe it and live by it, who exhibit in their relationships the beauty of God's character. In one sense, this chapter should have been first, because its message is the pathway to everything else. The spiritual reality of rejected, slain, raised lies at the heart of everything in the Christian life, including the work of developing a Christian mind. Only as we cooperate with God in dying to sin and self are we open to receiving the mind of Christ. 1 Corinthians 2:16. May God give us the grace to be worldview missionaries, bringing lives and communities that give an authentic witness of his existence before a watching world.
Wow. Brittany, you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. I love the way you asked that question, like, why should a busy mom or dad read this book? This is such a good reminder. It reminds me of the warning in scripture about not many of you should be teachers. And at CC, we really do believe that each parent is the child's best teacher. And I love how Nancy Piercy reminds us that the whole point of following Christ is to imitate him. My pastor recently, he's also a professor at a seminary, and he gave this beautiful 2-minute explanation of what it means to preach Christ. And basically his point was, well, when you're preaching Christ, it should be an encounter with Christ. I thought, that's really what I'm supposed to be doing each day before my children. It should be an encounter with Christ. If I'm walking with him and thinking about him, and then studying the world with them, the world that Christ made, I just appreciate the way that she doesn't just talk about total truth as it applies to my intellectual knowledge of the creator and his world or his cosmos. You know, she also is reminding us of the call to follow him in obedience, to die to ourselves and to try to submit ourselves to that inner transformation. And I think CC's helped remind me of that, even as I study things that weren't on the top of my list to study, because I needed to study them because I was a homeschooling mom. You know, that's encouraged me it's an encouragement that we have the mind of Christ. It's also an encouragement that Christ gives us that power to be able to slowly but surely become more like him for our children.
And I liked thinking about it, both as you were talking and as we were reading this quote, that you know, the witness of that transformation and that dying to self is a community of love. And so I'm grateful for the now 20 years that I've been able to walk that out in CC communities and love students and love parents and have us love and care for one another, that's the practical outworking of our views. So
Absolutely.
I think within the classical renewal, there's a segment of people, and maybe a temptation for a majority of people, to pursue big ideas, and that's a good thing. But when those ideas are just speculative ideas, right? When they're just knowing about something, they're just intellectual fancies of a sort. And I think what I really appreciate about this and the reminder that it brings for everything else is that it's got to be subject to Christ, right? That all these little T truths have to be ordered rightly under the capital T truth. And that when they are, then they're unleashed to be powerful instead of just speculative, right? Instead of useless ponderings. So when we line up our truths under Christ, then we see how they're useful. Like how do we love our neighbor well? When we learn about human nature, we're not doing it to be an anthropologist or a psychologist or psychiatrist or something. We're learning about it because it's how we learn about ourselves and our neighbors, that we can love them better. We can be hospitable, we can be good counselors to them. And that's living it out instead of just knowing about it.
Yeah, and that aspect of speculative that you were just talking about, Tim, that's the kind of worldview as like a set of glasses kind of deal. You know, Piercy's using the term because in some sense it was experiencing a revival. It's an older philosophical term. She introduces kind of the origin, but I think it is important to think about it as like world being, which is not a good term, right? Which is why it's not going to be used in the book. But that kind of embodied element in the sense, right, that like when things are subject to the capital T truth, the capital T truth is principally embodied. That's the person of Christ, the incarnational person of Christ. And so this is just a great reminder that it's that that spiritual reality that she mentions in that second paragraph at the heart of everything in the Christian life, including developing a Christian mind, but not limited, right?
Not limited to that. Yeah, I actually think we should make your term a thing. World being. Yeah, I think we should try to get it to catch on.
We can try.
All right. Well, we just have a very few minutes left, probably 5 at the most. But I did not want to neglect the idea that Daniel gave us a teaser about at the beginning. And so we have all these big ideas in the book, but Piercy also gives some really simple ideas at times. And she gives this 3-pronged litmus test for comparing biblical truth to other kinds of worldviews. So I'll read this last one for us. A wonderfully simple and effective means of comparing worldviews is to apply the same grid of creation, fall, and redemption. After all, every worldview or ideology has to answer the same three sets of questions. One, creation. Translated into worldview terms, creation refers to ultimate origins. Every worldview or philosophy has to start with a theory of origins. Where did it all come from? Who are we and how did we get here? Two, fall. Every worldview also offers a counterpart to the fall, an explanation of the source of evil and suffering. What has gone wrong with the world? Why is there warfare and conflict? And three, redemption. Finally, to engage people's hearts, every worldview has to instill hope by offering a vision of redemption, an agenda for reversing the fall and setting the world right again. So if you missed those and you're listening, it's creation, fall, and redemption. So how has that changed how you think about these things?
It's helpful, again, I think, to know how to talk to people who are without a Christian worldview. To maybe use this as sort of a diagnosis, right? Diagnostic tool. Often what people are missing is hope, right? There's a hopelessness that's behind a lot of the brokenness that people experience in this world. And if you can figure out what they're missing of these three things, that maybe would help you understand what's broken in their worldviews. Not because you can fill that gap, sort of patch it up, but maybe so that you can have a caring and loving conversation about why it is that Christ is the answer, not to supplement their worldview, but to replace their worldview.
You look like you have a thought, Daniel.
Yeah.
Oh, yes, I do. I was zoning out for a second. I really like that social application that you just described, Tim. I'm thinking of like introvertive, like, reflective elements of this structure as well. And thinking like, I believe maybe propositionally inside the creation account, but then maybe like, what does it look like to reflect on it and to kind of deepen the commitment to, well, what does it mean that the, creation comes from ultimate origins? And I think like, authors have done this in the past in different texts, is like prayers that sound philosophical in some sense. I think it's kind of fascinating. And then, what is the consequence of the fall? How has that shaped the world that I inhabit? How does it shape my weekly, daily cosmos, my classroom cosmos? I've been thinking about that a lot this year. And then, what does it look like to have hope in the redemption? How do we reflect on that and then allow that to kind of invade the fallen space as best we can? It's three really good categories.
I like that. Thinking about redemption, invading our fallen space. That's a nice phrase. I think we cut off your thought, Brittany. So what were you thinking about?
Oh, no, that was great. I thank you I was also thinking sort of the way Daniel was thinking too. I love collecting good questions. And I think the questions she offers here really encourage a healthy spirit of inquiry. Creation, where did it all come from? Who are we? How did we get here? Fall, what has gone wrong with the world? Why is there warfare and conflict? And redemption, what can we do about it? How can the world be set right again? I think those are great ways those are wonderful categories to give our students to think about any type of religion or worldview they encounter. My students are Challenge 4 students right now. We're thinking about the pagan world of the ancient Greeks. And, they were theists. So there's lots of things that we have in common with some of the truths that are by common grace known by by them, but these are really great questions to figure out, to compare a worldview with that's different than ours to Christianity. And then to think about how the implications of those answers that ought to come from our Christian beliefs, how that ought to govern our daily lives. She talks a lot in the book about restoration and how we can be part of the cultural mandate of being good stewards and going forth as imitations of Christ and being sub-creators and going just about the ordinary work that we have, that God has given us to do and gifted us to do. So I think that's also something we could talk about with our students. What is the call? I know my students in particular, Challenge 4 kids, are really wrestling with that right now. How can I be a sub-creator? Yeah.
Yeah, and then just to kind of weave all this together as we close, I was just thinking that as Tim was talking, that as far as fodder for conversations, if we are talking to folks in this broken world, they just like our students, they know that they're wrestling with an idea, but it's not what the question is that they're asking. And so these simple questions surrounding the creation and the fall and the redemption are a really lovely way for us to have, and a really simple way for us to have a conversation and even just help people formulate their questions that they're trying to ask. And then we can enter into a conversation. So I think that's a lovely part of this book, because sometimes when we think about worldview, we do think about that authoritarian pounding some kind of view into someone's head, but really this is just a lovely way to engage questions and struggles that people are facing and help them form their questions and find answers to the questions. So whether they're students or our adult friends or our parents or elderly neighbors, whoever they are, we can help with those conversations. So, all right. Well, Tim, I'll let you close this out for the day.
All right. Well, thanks for being with us today. Look forward to being together next time, and keep reading. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, guys. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.